So one of the arguments I try and make in my book is that we've consistently, for generations now, talked about these civil rights photographs as being important for showing how distant Northern whites were from the beliefs and the actions of Southern white actors. And I think one of the things that's important is to return the complexity of the 1960s to our understanding of how it is that whites continued to share certain values because they continued to understand themselves as being a community of whites. Whiteness is obviously not about genetics so much as it is buying into a certain worldview. And the conservatives and the liberals both understood that worldview, having at its foundation blacks who we did things to, speaking as a white person now, or we did things for, again, speaking as a white person. I want to stress here that I'm not at all trying to make the claim that Life or other Northern periodicals were doing this as a kind of conspiracy. They weren't trying to keep African Americans down. In fact, they were circulating these photos for precisely the opposite reason. They wanted at least moderate civil rights change to be possible. And they appreciated that these kinds of photos would allow whites in the North to sympathize and to not feel threatened. But what I want us to appreciate is that by circulating photographs that were trying to initiate incremental change, but that at their base showed blacks as being passive, there was a kind of way in which the grammar of change was sort of pre-structured, that there were limits to what could possibly be changed. Because if the ultimate goal is to have a society where everybody is sharing equally in privileges, everybody has access to power, these photos couldn't get us there. Because these photos could only get us as far as giving blacks more rights as long as ultimate power remained with white audiences. There was a way in which reform could only go so far through these images or through the kind of framing that these images were given in the white press during the period. And I want to give you one kind of micro example of just how complicated these images can be and the readings of them are. This photo was taken by a guy named Bill Hudson in Birmingham at the beginning of May of '63, the same moment when Moore was out there taking pictures in the streets. It's arguably the most reproduced image of Birmingham. The day after it was taken, it appeared in, I've found it in more than 24 Northern periodicals. So incredibly famous images. I'm sure many of you have seen it before. It appears in textbooks today. Again, not with a lot of descriptive information, but just as this is what civil rights is about. Because it seems to reduce, kind of boil down the conflict to its essential element. You see in the center of the composition one of the Southern police officers who's unleashing this police dog who's in the process of biting that young marcher. In virtually every description of this photograph that appeared in the white press, and I've literally got 3-4 dozen of them, the figure on the left-hand side is talked about as passive, meek, accepting, Christ-like, suffering for a cause, etc., etc. People focus on his slack right arm, on his downward gaze, on his relatively respectable dress, on the fact that he's just sort of meekly accepting his fate. That's the standard way in which this thing gets read. Now what's interesting is that in the black press there was a radically different reading of this image. Jet magazine published this thing at the same time that it appeared in the white press, but they actually went a step farther than the white reporters because they actually interviewed this guy whose name is Walter Gadsden. He's 15 years old at the time that the photograph was taken. What's fascinating about the reading in the black press is that black readers understood that this guy was, first of all, came from a conservative Southern family that was totally against King in the protest movement in Birmingham. He had no sympathy. He was not a protester protesting that day, but rather he had skipped school and he came downtown to see what his protesting friends were up to. We also know that Gadsden grew up in a household with a lot of large animals, and he received training from his father in how to protect himself around dogs. You can maybe notice here that his left knee is raised pretty high, higher than you would imagine if he was simply walking in the street. He's in the process of trying to knee the dog's jaw to try and break the dog's jaw. What you also might notice, but that white viewers didn't during the period, is that Gadsden is holding the outstretched right arm of the policeman. He's gripping it. For anyone trained in nonviolent civil disobedience in Birmingham, it was a total no-no to ever touch the person who was attacking you. Gadsden was showing a kind of self-defense that if white audiences had seen it, would have totally deflated that saintly, passive way in which the image was understood. So whites circulated this thing that was not about a protester, that was not about passive, meek acceptance, because they simply edited out the elements of the scene that didn't seem to fit with their pre-existing view. Quite likely the jockey boy sign over his shoulder and the fact that he is well dressed and that at least his right hand is slumped allowed them to not see the visual evidence of the scene and to categorize it in a way that made sense given what was already the dominant ways in which civil rights readings were understood. Black audiences read the same scene in the exact opposite way. To them it was a scene of active resistance to arbitrary white authority. So all of that level of complexity embedded into this one image. But it's even more interesting than that, I think, because I looked up a series of quotes about how this image is talked about in the 21st century. And the way it's talked about, I'll give you just 4 quick quotes here. Gadsden, on the left, is described as tall, thin, well-dressed. He leans into the dog with a look of passive calm, his eyes lowered. He's also talked about as passive. He's talked about as exhibiting classic nonviolence. And he's talked about as having a bearing that's passive, even limp. So in the 21st century, these are all white critics, continue to see this image in exactly the same way. So there are at least 2 different ways in which we can look at it. We can imagine that white audiences have continued to be conditioned by the original way in which this image was presented, or we could argue also that maybe the white audiences continue to have a similar kind of work done in the modern context. That is, maybe there's a continuing need on the part of certain liberal whites to imagine blacks in essentially inactive poses as essentially passive, to continue the kind of sympathy that exists for the civil rights movement. Even more revealing, sort of one more level of complication, in 2002, a scholar conducted a fairly small but revealing survey of college students and their attitudes towards civil rights imagery. She showed a group of students the full image of Gadsden's attack with the police, and her survey was of mostly a self-identified liberal group of students. Only 20% of the students had ever seen this photograph reproduced before. And yet virtually every student knew that it was a civil rights issue, not a surprise. Virtually every student knew that it was bad, racist Southern cop against good, upstanding black civil rights protester, again not a surprise. But the students, 80% of whom had never seen the image before, consistently read it as the figure on the left-hand side being passive, being accepting, being meek in the face of police brutality. So what's interesting to me is that there's a level at which these photos get framed in the 1960s as a certain thing, but there's an afterlife of these photos that now, almost 50 years after this thing is taken, even people who haven't seen the photos before are either so schooled in the dominant narrative of how we need to read these images, or continue to be influenced by a kind of white need to feel in control, that this thing is still being read in the same way. Even on the PBS website for Eyes on the Prize, this guy is described as a civil rights protester who's, does that mean my time's up?
No.
As a civil rights protester who's meekly accepting his fate. Now, I know that for most of the general public, of course, and I think even for sort of well-educated, more academically inclined people, we're much more aware of the ways in which images of blacks specifically, but of racial minorities in general, can do dangerous work by making them seem like violent, like aggressive. Everybody, I'm sure, remembers the Time magazine cover after O.J. Simpson was arrested and the controversy that ensued because they darkened his visage from the original mugshot and they made him look more threatening. There was a huge debate about how they shouldn't have done that. Newsweek magazine published the undoctored image, so a lot of people had the two before them that they could compare. What was unfortunate about the debate is that we never talked about why making somebody darker necessarily makes them more threatening, or the cultural values that are embedded in that. But I use this merely to show the notion that we understand the dangers that come from taking people of color and making them seem more dangerous. I'm trying to make the argument that there's a flip side to that equation. There's a way that's often been overlooked of how liberals have expectations of people of color, well-behaved people of color, good people of color, needing to be passive, needing to be acted upon. And I'm making the argument that this performs a similarly dangerous work that often goes unexamined in 1960s culture, but often in contemporary culture today. That this danger is still with us. Give you sort of another turn because it's hard for me to leave out gender, but gender also kind of complicates this to an added degree. Most historians of race make the claim that race cannot be disentangled from class and gender. I'm sure that's familiar to most of you. I show you here, famously, Rosa Parks being fingerprinted. What probably many of you know is that Rosa Parks was the third woman in 1955 who refused to give up her seat on a bus. But E.D. Nixon, the NAACP lawyer who was advising the NAACP during the time, was worried that the first two women/girls were not appropriate people to have test cases challenging civil rights. The first one was pregnant, unmarried teenager, and the second one was living with an alcoholic father in great poverty. And the sense was that they needed a test case subject who upheld all the dominant markers of identity that white America would find acceptable, except for this one, except for an unwillingness to stand for the status quo as far as racial issues go. In other words, you needed someone who was perfect, that the white press could not find a distraction to focus on the fact, well, look, she's unmarried, or look, she lives with an alcoholic father, that they would then distract from the legitimacy of the claims about how segregation was something that obviously needed to be abolished. One of the interesting things is that for female civil rights protesters, they had a more constricted menu, a more constricted range of options that they could engage in during the period. Early civil rights protesters were always encouraged to be on their sort of Sunday best comportment, to dress in their best outfits, to do everything that was appropriate aside from whatever the protest action that they was engaging in. For women then, it became not only impossible to agitate against the patriarchy, for instance, as they were agitating against white power, but there was a way in which they had to uphold the values of the patriarchy if they had any possibility of being able to make a difference on civil rights. So women civil rights protesters had a kind of straitjacket that was even more constraining than some of their male peers, because they had to uphold sort of other dominant indices of identity in order to be effective as a civil rights demonstrator. So this thing becomes even more difficult. What else could have been possible? Well, that's a question that I often get asked. So if I'm saying that all these iconic images did a lot of damage along the way of doing incremental reform, what else could one have done? I think that there was another kind of range of visual images that were out there that could have done more long-term, at least, productive work. The poster that I'm showing you is produced by SNCC. The photo that it was originally based on was taken by Danny Lyon, a white staff photographer, who through the early 1960s at least was one of the more important SNCC photographers. It shows a group of SNCC activists in Washington, D.C. during the March on Washington in 1963. They're in the process of clapping and singing. The man with his hand extended is actually in the process of snapping his fingers, but most audiences tend to see it as a raised fist, which isn't at all what's going on there. But because it gets bled together with the end of now, and because in our post-1968 moment we tend to see raised black arms as being often more menacing, there's a lot of even scholars in the literature that look at this photo and talk about him raising a fist, which is obviously not what's happening.